Daughter, I dreamed my whole life about tomorrow. It will be beautiful to see you in a wedding dress. I told her with emotion. She slapped me in the face and replied, "You were a terrible mother. The wedding was yesterday, only for family." My answer paralyzed her. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. Honey, I've dreamed about tomorrow my whole life. It's going to be beautiful seeing you in that wedding dress. I said to her, my voice trembling with emotion as I stood in her doorway, holding the small gift bag I'd spent weeks choosing. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. The sharp crack echoed through her apartment hallway, and my cheek burned. With a pain that went deeper than skin. You were a terrible mother. The wedding was yesterday, just for family. Sadie's voice was ice cold, each word designed to cut. I stood there frozen, my hand slowly rising to touch my stinging cheek. The gift bag slipped from my other hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. 24 hours. I had missed my only daughter's wedding by 24 hours. Yesterday? The word came out as barely a whisper. But you said, the invitation said, there was no invitation for you. Sadie crossed her arms, standing in her doorway like a guard protecting her territory. I made sure of that. My legs felt weak. I gripped the door frame to steady myself, trying to process what she was saying. Sadie, please, I don't understand. Why would you, why? Her laugh was bitter, harsh. Because you were never there. When I needed you. Why should you be there now? The words hit me like physical blows. I stared at my daughter, this 32-year-old woman who looked so much like me at that age, but whose eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she was wearing a simple gray sweater, but I could see the faint tan line on her ring finger where a wedding band now Saturday. Can I at least see the pictures? My voice cracked, and I hated how desperate I sounded. No. She started to close the door, then paused. You know what the worst part is? I actually felt guilty for a few minutes yesterday. I kept looking at the empty chair where you should have been sitting, and I almost felt bad. Almost. Sadie, honey, whatever I did wrong, we can fix this. I love you so much, and I just want to be part of your life. I want to know my son-in-law. I want to meet my grandchildren someday. That's never going to happen. Her voice was final, absolute. You lost that right a long time ago. The door slammed shut, leaving me standing alone in the hallway of her apartment building. I could hear muffled voices inside, Sadie talking to someone, probably her new husband. Marcus, I thought his name was, though I'd only met him twice in the 3 years they'd been together. I picked up the gift bag from the floor. Inside was a pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother, Sadie's grandmother. I'd worn it on my own wedding day 28 years ago, back when I still believed in happily ever after. I'd planned to give it to Sadie on her wedding morning. To tell her the story of how my mother had worn it, and her mother before that. Now it felt heavy in my hands, like a chain of broken promises. The walk back to my car was a blur. My cheek still burned where she'd hit me, but that pain was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. I sat in the parking lot for what felt like hours, staring up at Sadie's window, hoping she might come down, might change her mind. She didn't. The drive home to my small house took 30 minutes, but I barely remembered it. My mind kept replaying the scene over and over. The cold fury in Sadie's eyes. The way she'd said, family, like I wasn't part of it. The sound of that door slamming with such finality. Inside my house, everything felt different. The wedding dress I'd bought and never worn still hung in my closet, tags attached. The guest room I'd prepared for when Sadie might visit, complete with fresh flowers and her favorite childhood books on the nightstand. The photo albums scattered across my coffee table, filled with pictures of a little girl who used to run to me when she scraped her knee, who used to beg me to read her one more bedtime story. I sat on my couch and picked up one of the albums. There was 5-year-old Sadie on her first day of kindergarten, gap-toothed and grinning. 8-year-old Sadie at her piano recital, looking so serious and grown up. 12-year-old Sadie at her middle school graduation, standing between me and my mother. In every picture, I looked tired. Dark circles under my eyes, shoulders slightly slumped, like I was carrying an invisible weight. But I was there. I was always there, wasn't I, or was I? The memories started flooding back then, uninvited and unwelcome. Sadie crying at her kindergarten graduation because I was 20 minutes late, having rushed straight from my job at the diner. The piano recital where I fell asleep in the audience after working a double shift. The school conference I missed because I couldn't get time off work, but there were good memories too. Weekend mornings when we'd make pancakes together, flour everywhere, both of us laughing. Summer evenings when we'd sit on the front porch and I'd braid her hair while she told me about her day. The way she used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. And how I'd hold her until she fell asleep. I reached for my phone, thinking maybe I could call her, try to explain. But explain what? That I'd done my best? That being a single mother working 3 jobs hadn't been easy? That every choice I'd made had been for her. My finger hovered over her contact, but I couldn't bring myself to dial. The sound of her voice, saying, "You were a terrible mother," echoed in my head, drowning out everything else. Instead, I found myself opening my laptop and searching for her social media. She'd blocked me months ago, but I knew her username. Through a mutual friends page, I found what I was looking for. Wedding photos. Sadie looked radiant in a simple white dress, her hair styled in elegant waves. Marcus looked handsome in his navy suit, gazing at her like she was the only person in the world. The ceremony appeared to be in someone's backyard. Intimate and beautiful, surrounded by about 30 people. I scrolled through the comments, seeing congratulations from friends and family members. Aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years. Cousins who'd apparently been invited when I wasn't. Even my own sister Margaret was there, smiling in the background of one photo. Margaret, who'd always thought I was too soft on Sadie. Margaret, who'd told me more than once that I was spoiling my daughter by working so hard to give her things I'd never had. Margaret, who'd been at my daughter's wedding while I sat at home, oblivious. The betrayal cut deep. Not just from Sadie, but from everyone who'd known and said nothing. How long had they all been planning this? How many conversations had happened behind my back? I closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch cushions. The house felt impossibly quiet, filled with the echo of dreams that would never come true. I'd imagined being the mother of the bride, helping with dress fittings, planning bridal showers, holding Sadie's hand before she walked down the aisle. Instead, I was 59 years old, sitting alone in my living room, trying to understand how I'd failed so completely that my own daughter couldn't bear to have me at the most important day of her life. But even as the tears started to fall, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that there was more to this story. Something I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it had never happened. Something that might explain why I'd been so tired in all those photos, why I'd missed so many moments, why I'd made choices that must have seemed selfish to a little girl who just wanted her mother's attention. The memories I'd spent 25 years trying to forget were starting to surface. And I wasn't sure I had the strength to face them again. 3 days had passed since Sadie slammed that door in my face, and I hadn't left my house. I kept thinking she might call, that maybe the shock of her cruelty would wear off and she'd remember that I was still her mother. But my phone stayed silent. I'd barely eaten, barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, twisted with disgust as she told me I was a terrible mother. The worst part was that a growing part of me believed she was right. The doorbell rang just after noon, startling me from my thoughts. For a wild moment, I hoped it might be Sadie, coming to apologize, to explain. Instead, I found my neighbor Mrs. Chen standing on my porch, holding a casserole dish and wearing a concerned expression. And, "Honey, I haven't seen you outside in days. Are you alright?" I forced a smile, trying to look normal. "I'm fine, just a bit under the weather." She studied my face, taking in what I knew must be obvious signs of crying and sleepless nights. "Did something happen with Sadie? I thought you were going to her wedding this week." The kindness in her voice nearly broke me. Mrs. Chen had watched Sadie grow up, had babysat her occasionally when I was desperate. She knew how much I loved my daughter. She got married. But I wasn't invited. The words tasted bitter in my mouth. Mrs. Chen's face fell. "Oh, sweetheart. There must be some misunderstanding. If only it were that simple." "No misunderstanding. She made it very clear that she doesn't want me in her life." Mrs. Chen pushed the casserole into my hands and followed me inside without being invited. She'd done this before, years ago, when things were really bad. She had a way of knowing when I needed someone, even when I was too proud to ask. "This doesn't make sense," she said, settling herself on my couch. "That little girl adored you. I remember how she used to watch for you at the window every evening, waiting for you to come home from work. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe she remembers waiting too much." I set the casserole on the kitchen counter and joined her in the living room. The photo albums were still scattered around from my desperate searching the other night, evidence of my attempts to understand where everything went wrong. Mrs. Chen picked up one of the albums, flipping through pages slowly. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a picture of 8-year-old Sadie's birthday party. "You threw her such beautiful parties. Remember this one? You worked extra shifts for 2 months to afford that Princess Castle cake." I remembered. I'd barely slept for weeks, working double shifts at the diner and cleaning offices at night, all so Sadie could have the fairy tale birthday she dreamed about. In the photo, she was beaming, surrounded by friends, and I was standing behind her, exhausted but smiling. "She doesn't remember the cake," I said quietly. "She probably just remembers that I fell asleep during the party games. You were exhausted because you'd been working yourself to death for her." Mrs. Chen continued turning pages, and we both grew quiet. In every photo, the pattern was the same. Sadie happy, excited, living the life I'd wanted to give her. And me? Always slightly apart, always tired, always carrying that invisible burden. And, Mrs. Chen said finally, her voice gentle but serious, have you ever told Sadie the truth about those years? About why you were working so much? My hands clenched. In my lap. There's no point. She's built her life around believing I was a bad mother. Why would I destroy that now? Because maybe she deserves to understand. I stood up abruptly, walking to the window that looked out onto the street where Sadie used to ride her bike. Some truths are too heavy for children to carry. Even grown children. Mrs. Chen joined me at the window. And some secrets are too heavy for mothers to carry alone. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the world continue its normal rhythm outside while mine felt completely upended. A young mother walked by pushing a stroller, and I felt a sharp pang of envy for her innocence, for the belief that love would be enough to protect her child from pain. I need to show you something, I said suddenly, turning away from the window. I led Mrs. Chen upstairs to my bedroom, to the closet where I kept the box I'd never opened in Sadie's presence. My hands shook as I pulled it down from the top shelf. Dust coating the cardboard surface. Inside were things I'd hoped never to look at again: hospital records, police reports, photographs of bruises that had long since healed but left scars that never would. Mrs. Chen's sharp intake of breath told me she understood immediately what she was looking at. Oh, and I knew things were bad with David, but I never realized. I pulled out a photograph that showed my face, swollen almost beyond recognition. This was taken when Sadie was 7. She was at my mother's house that weekend. She never saw me like this. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. How did you hide it from her? Makeup. Long sleeves. Staying away when the bruises were too obvious. I set the photo aside, my hands trembling. I told her I was working. It was easier than explaining why mommy couldn't come home sometimes. The memories came flooding back then, unstoppable. David's rages that came without warning. The way he'd smile at Sadie during the day and terrorize me at night. How I'd learned to read his moods, to send Sadie away when I sensed danger coming. The extra shifts at work, I continued, half of them weren't real. I'd sit in my car in the hospital parking lot until it was safe to go home. Or I'd sleep in the diner's storage room when Frank would let me. Anything to keep Sadie from seeing what he was doing to me. Mrs. Chen sat heavily on my bed, staring at the contents of the box. Why didn't you leave sooner? It was the question I'd asked myself 1,000 times. He threatened to take her. He had money, connections. I was nobody, a waitress with no education. He said if I left, he'd make sure I never saw her again. I pulled out another document, one that made my stomach clench even now. He had lawyers draw up papers claiming I was an unfit mother. Drug use, mental instability, neglect. All lies, but who would believe me over him? So you stayed. I survived. There's a difference. I closed the box, unable to look at the contents any longer. When Sadie was 13, he finally went too far. Put me in the hospital with internal bleeding. That's when I found the courage to press charges. Mrs. Chen reached for my hand. I remember when he left. Sadie was so confused about why her father suddenly wasn't around anymore. I told her he had to travel for work. Then that he'd moved away. Eventually, she stopped asking. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. I thought I was protecting her. I thought if she never knew how bad things really were, she could have normal memories of her childhood. But instead, she just remembers a mother who was never fully present. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. All those years of sacrifice, of enduring pain to protect her, and in the end, I'd lost her anyway. Maybe if I'd been honest from the beginning, if I'd explained why I was always tired, always working, always just slightly out of reach. She thinks I chose work over her, I whispered. She doesn't know that every choice I made was about keeping her safe. Mrs. Chen squeezed my hand. It's not too late to tell her. Yes, it is. She's made her decision about who I am. She's built a whole life around that story. Her new husband probably thinks he's protecting her from her terrible mother. How can I destroy that with the truth? We sat in silence, the weight of 25 years of hidden pain filling the room. Outside, I could hear children playing in the street, their laughter carrying through the window like an echo of the childhood I'd tried so hard to preserve for Sadie, but even as I spoke the words, even as I convinced Mrs. Chen and myself that it was too late, something deep inside me was stirring. A memory that I'd buried so completely I'd almost forgotten it existed. Something that changed everything about the story I'd been telling myself, something that meant Sadie's rejection might not be about my failures as a mother at all. After Mrs. Chen left, I found myself unable to stop thinking about that buried memory. It clawed at the edges of my consciousness, demanding attention I'd refused to give it for years. I paced through my house, trying to push it away, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with my bare hands. Finally, I went back to the closet and pulled out another box, one I hadn't touched in even longer. This one contained Sadie's school papers, artwork, report cards. Things a normal mother would treasure. Things I'd kept but couldn't bear to look at because they reminded me of everything I'd missed, but buried at the bottom was what I was really looking for. A letter, written in a 13-year-old's careful handwriting, that I'd found hidden under Sadie's mattress the day after her father disappeared from our lives. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, the creases worn from the few times I'd read it over the years before forcing myself to forget it existed. "Dear Daddy," it began, and my heart clenched just as it had the first time I'd seen those words. "I know you had to leave because of work, but I wanted you to know that I understand why you were always so angry with Mom. She really isn't a very good mother. She's always gone, and when she is home, she acts weird and jumpy. Sometimes I hear her crying at night, and it makes me feel bad inside, but I don't know what to do. I think maybe if she tried harder to be a better wife, you wouldn't have had to leave. I promise I'll take care of myself so she doesn't have to worry about me so much. Maybe then she'll be happier and you can come home. I miss you every day. I keep hoping you'll call or write, but Mom says you're too busy. I understand. I wouldn't want to talk to her either sometimes. Love always, your Sadie." The letter fluttered from my hands as the full weight of what I'd done crashed over me. I sank to the floor of my bedroom, my back against the wall, and finally allowed myself to remember what I'd spent decades trying to forget. I'd found this letter the morning after David left, when I was cleaning Sadie's room, looking for any signs that he'd hurt her too. She was at school, and I was alone with the aftermath of my decision to finally press charges, to finally say enough. The letter had destroyed me. Reading my daughter's words, seeing how completely I'd failed to protect her from the psychological damage of living in our house, had nearly broken me entirely. She blamed me for David's anger. She thought his rage was justified. She believed she needed to take care of herself because I was inadequate. Worse than that, she was waiting for him to come back. I'd made a choice that morning, sitting on her bedroom floor with that letter in my hands. I could tell her the truth about her father, show her the hospital photos, explain why I'd been so absent and afraid. I could make her understand that David was the monster, not me. But she was 13 years old, and she loved him. In her mind, he was the parent who brought her presents and took her to ice cream shops and never missed a school play. He was charming and attentive when he wanted to be, and she'd never seen the other side of him because I'd made sure of it. So I'd made the hardest decision of my life. I'd let her keep loving him. I'd let her blame me. I'd buried the letter and never spoke of it again, even when she started pulling away from me, even when she began treating me with the same dismissive coldness I'd once endured from David. I'd told myself I was protecting her innocence, saving her from the trauma of knowing what kind of man her father really was. But sitting there on my bedroom floor 25 years later, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been protecting Sadie. I'd been protecting myself from the look in her eyes when she learned that her hero was a monster, and that I'd been too weak to save us both sooner. The worst part was that my silence hadn't even worked. David might have been physically gone from our lives, but his poison had remained. Every criticism Sadie had ever leveled at me, every moment of coldness and distance, had been his voice speaking through her. I'd spent 2.5 decades being punished for his crimes, and I'd let it happen because I thought I deserved it. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking it might be Sadie. Instead, I saw my sister Margaret's name on the screen. "Hello, Margaret." Anne. Her voice was cool, professional. Margaret had always been the successful one, the one who'd married well and lived in the right neighborhood and never had to work 3 jobs to keep a roof over her head. "I suppose you've heard about Sadie's wedding." "I have." I closed my eyes, not wanting to hear whatever lecture she was preparing. It was a beautiful ceremony. Very intimate. She looked radiant. Each word was a small knife, precisely placed. Margaret had always known exactly how to hurt me while maintaining plausible deniability. I'm glad she was happy. She was. Though. She seemed a little sad that you couldn't make it. I sat up straighter. "Couldn't make it?" "Margaret, I wasn't invited." A pause. "That's not what she told us. She said you'd been asked but that you were too busy with work to come. Something about a big project you couldn't leave." The lie hit me like a slap. Sadie hadn't just excluded me from her wedding, she'd created a story that made me look selfish and career-obsessed. She'd let everyone believe that I'd chosen work over her most important day, just like she believed I'd chosen work over her throughout her childhood. "That's not true," I said quietly. "Oh." Margaret's voice lost some of its smugness. "Well, perhaps there was some miscommunication." "No miscommunication. She told me very clearly that I wasn't welcome." Another pause, longer this time. When Margaret spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly. "And, what happened between you two? She used to talk about you constantly when she was younger. You were her whole world." The question I'd been asking myself for years. I don't know. One day she loved me, and the next day she didn't. I never understood what changed. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I knew exactly when things had changed. It was after David left, when Sadie had waited for him to come back and he never did. When she'd realized that her perfect father was gone forever, and all she had left was the mother she'd been taught to see as inadequate. Maybe. Margaret's voice was hesitant now, uncertain. Maybe you should try talking to her. Really talking. About everything. After Margaret hung up, I sat in my living room, staring at the photo albums scattered around me. In every picture. After David left, I could see it now. The gradual cooling in Sadie's eyes. The way she started standing slightly apart from me. The walls going up brick by brick, year by year. I'd thought time would heal the distance between us. I'd thought if I just kept loving her, kept trying, eventually she'd come back to me. But time had only made the walls higher, the distance greater. Now she was married, starting a new life with a man who probably saw me as the negligent mother who damaged his wife. She'd surrounded herself with people who confirmed her version of our story, who validated her belief that I was the problem, and maybe I was. Not for the reasons she thought, but because I'd chosen silence over truth, protection over honesty. I'd let her father's voice become her voice, and I'd been too much of a coward to fight back. But as I sat there surrounded by the evidence of our broken relationship, something began to shift inside me. A stirring of the woman I'd been before. David broke me down. Before I learned to accept blame that wasn't mine to carry. I picked up the letter again, reading Sadie's 13-year-old words about wanting to take care of herself so I wouldn't have to worry. About understanding why her father was angry with me. About missing the man who'd terrorized me for years while she slept safely in her room. For 25 years, I'd carried the weight of her misunderstanding. I'd let her believe I was weak, absent, selfish. I'd protected David's memory at the cost of my own relationship with my daughter. Maybe it was time to stop protecting him. Maybe it was time for Sadie to know the truth about the man she'd spent her whole life missing, and the mother who'd sacrificed everything to keep her safe from him. Maybe it was time to fight back. I spent 3 days writing the letter. 3 days of starting over, crumpling up pages, staring at blank screens. How do you explain 25 years of silence? How do you tell your daughter that everything she believes about her childhood is a carefully constructed lie designed to protect her from a truth too ugly to bear? In the end, I kept it simple. Just the facts, laid out in chronological order, with copies of the hospital records and police reports attached. Let the evidence speak for itself, but before I could send it, I needed to see her one more time. I needed to look into her eyes and give her the choice of whether to hear the truth or continue living with the story she'd built her life around. I drove to her apartment building on a Saturday morning, knowing Marcus would likely be home too. I decided that was probably better. She'd need support when she heard what I had to tell her, and despite barely knowing him, I hoped he loved her enough to help her through what was coming. This time, when I knocked on her door, she opened it immediately, as if she'd been expecting someone else. Her face fell when she saw me. I told you I didn't want to see you. I know. But I have something to tell you, and after I do, I promise I'll leave you alone if that's what you want. She started to close the door, but I held up the manila envelope I'd brought. It's about your father. The words stopped her cold. Her hand froze on the door handle, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of the little girl who used to ask me every night when Daddy was coming home. What about him? The truth about why he left. The truth about why I was always working, always tired, always. I paused, searching for the right words. Always failing you. Marcus appeared behind her, his hand settling protectively on her shoulder. He was tall, dark-haired, with kind eyes that reminded me of my own father. Looking at him, I felt a pang of gratitude that Sadie had found someone who seemed to genuinely care about her. Sadie, who is this? He asked gently. My mother. The words came out flat, emotionless. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. I could see him processing this information, probably comparing my appearance to whatever stories Sadie had told him about me. Mrs., he started. And, I said. Just Anne. Would you like to come in? He asked, and I could see Sadie tense beside him. Marcus, no. I don't want her here. Honey, she's your mother. Maybe you should hear what she has to say. The fact that this man, who barely knew me, was willing to advocate for me when my own daughter wouldn't, nearly broke me. But I held myself together, focusing on what I'd come here to do. I don't need to come in, I said. But Sadie, you need to know something. Your father didn't leave because of work. He didn't leave because I was a bad wife or because you weren't enough to make him happy. He left because I finally found the courage to press charges against him for domestic violence. Sadie's face went white. That's not true. I held out the envelope. Hospital records. Police reports. Photos. Everything is documented. She stared at the envelope like it might bite her. You're lying. Daddy never hurt anyone. He never even raised his voice. Not around you. Never around you. I made sure of that. Marcus was looking between us, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Sadie, maybe you should look at what she brought. No. Sadie backed away from the door, shaking her head. This is just another one of her manipulations. She can't stand that I'm happy, so she's trying to ruin my memories of the only parent who actually loved me. The words cut deep, but I'd expected them. David had been charming, attentive, the perfect father whenever Sadie was around. Of course she'd loved him. Of course she'd seen him as the good parent. I know how much you loved him, I said softly. I know he was wonderful to you. That's what I wanted, Sadie. That's what all the working and the tiredness was about. I was trying to keep you safe so you could keep loving him without knowing what he was capable of. Stop. Sadie's voice was rising, panic creeping in. Just stop talking. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I'd been silent for too long. The night shifts at the diner that you hated so much? Half of them weren't real. I was sitting in my car in parking lots, waiting for him to calm down so I could come home safely. The times I missed your school events? I was in the emergency room getting stitches, getting x-rays, trying to hide the evidence so you wouldn't know. Shut up. Sadie clapped her hands over her ears like a child trying to block out a nightmare. Marcus stepped forward, his face grim. What exactly are you saying happened? I met his eyes, and I could see the moment he understood. The way his expression shifted from confusion to horror to protective fury. Your father-in-law was an abuser, I said simply. For years. And I let him stay in our lives because he threatened to take Sadie away from me if I left. I was nobody, Marcus. A waitress with no education, no money, no power. He had lawyers, connections, a reputation. He could have made me disappear from her life completely. Sadie was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. You're destroying everything. Why are you doing this to me? Because you're destroying us based on a lie. I took a step closer, my voice gentle but firm. You think I was a terrible mother because I wasn't present enough, because I was always working, always tired. But I was fighting a war, Sadie. Every single day, I was fighting to keep you safe and innocent and loved. Marcus had his arms around Sadie now, holding her as she fell apart. Over her head, his eyes met mine, and I saw something that gave me hope. He believed me. Maybe because he could see the pain in my face, or maybe because some part of this story explained things about Sadie that had never made sense to him before. The letter, I continued, reaching into my purse. The one you wrote to him after he left, telling him you understood why he was angry with me. I found it under your mattress. Sadie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been shame. You kept it, she whispered. I kept everything. Every drawing, every report card, every piece of evidence that you were the most important thing in my world. But I also kept the evidence of what he did to me, because I knew someday I might need to prove it. I held out the letter, and this time, Sadie took it with trembling hands. As she read her own 13-year-old words, I watched 25 years of carefully constructed beliefs begin to crumble. I thought, she said, her voice broken, I thought if I was better, if I took care of myself more, maybe he'd come back. Oh, sweetheart. The endearment slipped out before I could stop it. He was never coming back. And that was the best thing that could have happened to us, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. Marcus was looking at the police reports now, his jaw clenched with anger. How long did this go on? 7 years. From the time Sadie was 6 until she was 13. 7 years. Sadie's voice was hollow. 7 years of this, and I never knew. Because I made sure you never knew. Every bruise hidden, every hospital visit explained away, every night I didn't come home because it wasn't safe. I chose your innocence over my own safety, and I'd do it again. We stood there in the doorway, the three of us, surrounded by the wreckage of the story Sadie had built her adult life around. I could see her trying to process it all, trying to reconcile the father she remembered with the man described in those police reports. I need time, she said finally. I need to think about all of this. I nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need. But Sadie, I want you to know something. You weren't the reason he left. You weren't the reason I was tired all the time. And you're not responsible for fixing what was broken in our house. I turned to go, then stopped. One more thing. That night you slapped me and told me I was a terrible mother? You sounded exactly like him. And maybe it's time to ask yourself, whose voice you've been carrying all these years. As I walked back to my car, I heard the door close softly behind me. Not slammed this time. Just closed, with the quiet finality of a chapter ending. Whether it was the end of our story or the beginning of a new one remained to be seen. 2 weeks passed without a word from Sadie. I'd given her the truth, laid bare 25 years of Carefully guarded secrets, and now all I could do was wait. Some days I convinced myself that silence was better than rejection. Other days, the quiet felt like drowning. I was tending to my small garden on a Thursday afternoon when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the living room window, I could see Sadie's blue sedan parked behind my old Honda. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched her sit behind the wheel for several minutes, not moving. When she finally emerged, she looked thinner than she had 2 weeks ago, like the weight of truth had worn her down to something fragile. She carried a manila folder in her hands, similar to the one I'd given her, and her movements were careful, deliberate, like someone walking through a minefield. I met her at the front door before she could knock. "I've been doing research," she said without preamble. Her voice was hoarse, tired. "About domestic violence. About how children process it when they don't see it directly." I stepped aside, and she walked into my living room, settling on the couch with the same hesitant movements I remembered from her childhood when she wasn't sure if she was in trouble. "I found articles," she continued, opening her folder, "about how abusers manipulate situations to maintain the illusion of being good parents. How they can be charming and loving to children while terrorizing their partners." I sat across from her, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to do anything that might make her change her mind about having this conversation. I also called Aunt Margaret. My stomach dropped. Margaret, who'd never liked David but had never said why. Margaret, who'd always been protective of Sadie in ways I'd never fully understood. "She told me things," Sadie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things she'd been keeping secret for 25 years because she promised you she would." I closed my eyes, remembering the desperate phone calls I'd made to my sister during the worst times. The nights I'd shown up at her door with bruises I couldn't explain to my daughter. The way Margaret had begged me to leave David, to take Sadie, and disappear. "She said you came to her house one night when I was 8. Your ribs were broken, and you could barely walk, but you made her promise not to call the police because David had threatened to take me out of state." The memory hit me like a physical blow. That had been the night David had discovered I'd been hiding money for an escape fund. He'd found the envelope taped under the kitchen sink and had beaten me so severely I'd thought he might kill me. But even then, bleeding and broken, my only thought had been protecting Sadie. "Margaret wanted to help you leave," Sadie continued. "She offered to hide us both, to help you start over somewhere safe. But you refused because David's lawyers had already filed papers claiming I was being neglected, that you were mentally unstable. You were afraid if you ran, you'd lose me forever." I nodded, unable to speak. Those had been the darkest days, when I'd felt completely trapped, when every choice felt like the wrong one. "I've been thinking about that letter I wrote to him," Sadie said, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "About how I blamed you for his anger, how I thought if you were a better wife, he'd come home. I've been trying to remember what made me write those things." She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in decades. Not the coldness or judgment I'd grown accustomed to, but confusion and pain and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I remember him talking to me sometimes after you'd go to work. Little comments about how hard you were on him, how you didn't appreciate everything he did for us. He never said anything directly, but he planted these ideas in my head about you. Being difficult, demanding." The manipulation had been so subtle, so carefully crafted. David had turned my own daughter into an ally against me without her ever realizing what was happening. "He used to tell me I was the only one who really understood him," Sadie continued. "That you were always angry about something, always complaining. He made it seem like he and I were on the same team, like we both had to deal with your moods." "I wasn't angry at him," I said quietly. "I was terrified of him." "There's a difference." Sadie nodded, tears starting to fall. "I know that now. I've been reading about trauma responses, about how fear can look like anger to a child who doesn't understand what's happening." She pulled out another paper from her folder. "I also found this." It was a medical record, one I'd hoped she'd never see. From the night David had put me in the hospital with internal bleeding, the night that had finally given me the courage to press charges. "The doctor's notes say you told him you fell down the stairs. But there's another note from a nurse, who wrote that your injuries were consistent with assault, not a fall." I remembered that nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who'd held my hand while the doctor stitched up the gash on my forehead. She'd whispered that I didn't have to lie, that there were people who could help. But I'd been too afraid to tell the truth, even then. "The night this happened," Sadie said, pointing to the date on the record, "I remember you being gone. You told me you had to work a double shift, and I was angry because it was the night before my 8th grade dance. I'd wanted you to help me with my hair." "I was in the hospital," I said, my voice breaking. "Fighting for my life. And the next morning, you came home and did my hair anyway. You sat behind me at your vanity mirror, and your hands were shaking so badly you could barely hold the curling iron. I thought you were just tired from work." The memory was vivid in my mind. I discharged myself from the hospital against medical advice because I couldn't bear the thought of Sadie waking up alone. I'd driven home with double vision from the concussion, my ribs screaming with every breath, determined not to miss another important moment in her life. I was in so much pain I could barely stand, I admitted. But you were so excited about the dance, and I'd already missed too many things. Sadie's face crumpled. All those times I was angry at you for being tired, for not being present enough. You were recovering from being beaten. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 25 years of misunderstanding settling between us. I wanted to reach for her, to comfort her, but I wasn't sure I had that right anymore. I need to ask you something, Sadie said finally. When he left, when you pressed charges, why didn't you tell me the truth then? I was 13. I could have understood. I'd known this question was coming, and I'd spent 2 weeks preparing my answer. But now, looking at my daughter's tear-stained face, all my careful explanations seemed inadequate. Because you loved him, I said simply. In spite of everything, you loved your father, and he'd never hurt you directly. I thought if I could let you keep that love, if I could bear the weight of your resentment instead of making you hate the man who'd been your hero, then maybe I could protect you from one more trauma. But it didn't protect me, Sadie said, her voice breaking. It just made me hate the wrong person. The truth of it settled over us like a shroud. My sacrifice, my silence, my willingness to be the villain in her story, had backfired completely. Instead of protecting her, I damaged our relationship beyond repair and allowed David's poison to continue affecting her long after he was gone. I made a mistake, I said. I thought love meant protecting you from painful truths. But maybe love means trusting someone enough to let them handle the truth, even when it's ugly. Sadie looked down at her hands, still clutching the medical records. I've been so cruel to you. For so many years, I've been punishing you for things he did. You didn't know. But I should have known. Her voice was fierce now, angry at herself. I'm a grown woman. I should have questioned the story I'd built in my head. I should have wondered why someone who supposedly loved me would abandon me so completely. I should have asked more questions instead of just accepting that you were the problem. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that I understood, that she'd been a child caught in an impossible situation. But I could see she needed to say these things. Needed to work through the guilt and anger at herself. The wedding, she said suddenly. Oh God, the wedding. I excluded you from the most important day of my life because I was still carrying his voice in my head, still believing his version of who you were. Sadie, no, let me finish. She looked up at me, and I saw a determination in her eyes that reminded me of myself at her age. I need to make this right. I need to tell Marcus the whole truth, and I need to figure out how to undo 25 years of damage. For the first time in decades, I felt a spark of hope. Not for complete reconciliation, not for a fairy tale ending, but for something more precious. The possibility of truth between us. The chance to build something new on the wreckage of what we'd lost. 6 months after that afternoon in my living room, I stood in Sadie's kitchen, watching her move around the space with the same efficient grace I'd once possessed. She was making Sunday dinner, something she'd started doing after our reconciliation began, and I was learning how to be a guest in my daughter's life rather than an unwelcome intruder. Mom, can you hand me the oregano? She asked, and the simple word still made my heart catch every time she said it. Not and or nothing at all, but Mom, spoken without the bitter edge it had carried for so many years. I reached for the spice rack, noting how she'd organized it exactly the way I used to when she was small. Some habits, it seemed, survived. Even the longest estrangements. Marcus emerged from the living room where he'd been setting the table, and I was still getting used to the easy warmth in his smile when he looked at me. It had taken him time to process the truth about David, time to understand why Sadie had been so resistant to letting anyone get too close. But once he'd absorbed it all, he'd become one of my strongest advocates for healing our relationship. How's the roast coming along? He asked Sadie, pressing a kiss to her temple. Almost ready. Mom, would you mind checking on the potatoes? The simple request for help, the assumption that I belonged in her kitchen, was still new enough to feel like a gift. For months after our confrontation, our interactions had been careful, tentative. Sadie had needed time to process not just the truth about David, but the extent to which his manipulation had shaped her perception of me. She'd started therapy, something she'd resisted for years because David had always dismissed mental health treatment as weakness. Through those sessions, she'd begun to untangle the web of beliefs he'd woven around her, to separate her own thoughts and feelings from the ones he'd planted. The potatoes were perfect, golden and crispy on the outside, fluffy within. I'd taught Sadie this recipe when she was 12, one of the few cooking lessons she'd been interested in learning. Now, watching her recreate it with such care, I felt the strange satisfaction of seeing your legacy live on in unexpected ways. There Ready, I announced, and Sadie smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Good. I was worried I'd overcooked them. I still remember how you used to say timing was everything in cooking. It was moments like this that made the long journey to forgiveness worthwhile. Not grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but simple acknowledgments that I had been her mother once, that I had taught her things, that my presence in her life had mattered. The doorbell rang just as we were transferring food to serving dishes, and Sadie's face lit up in a way that told me she'd been expecting someone. I'll get it, Marcus said, but Sadie was already wiping her hands on a towel and heading for the door. I heard voices in the foyer, Sadie's excited greeting and a deeper voice responding. When she returned to the kitchen, she wasn't alone. The man following her was in his 40s, tall and lean with salt and pepper hair and eyes the same shade of brown as Sadie's. He carried a small bouquet of flowers and wore the slightly nervous expression of someone meeting important people for the first time. Mom, Sadie said, her voice carrying a note of barely contained excitement, I'd like you to meet someone. This is Dr. James Chen, from the hospital where I work. James, this is my mother, Anne. I accepted the flowers he offered, noting the way he looked at Sadie, the gentle attentiveness that reminded me of how Marcus had looked at her in the early days of their relationship. But there was something different here, a deeper connection that spoke of shared experiences and understanding. It's wonderful to finally meet you, James said, his handshake firm and warm. Sadie talks about you constantly. The words created a flutter of joy in my chest. After so many years of being someone Sadie was ashamed of, the idea that she spoke of me at all, much less constantly, felt miraculous. Over dinner, I learned that James was a trauma counselor who specialized in working with survivors of domestic violence. He and Sadie had met when she'd started volunteering at the hospital's support group, something she'd begun doing after learning the truth about our past. She has an incredible gift for connecting with people who've been through what you experienced, James told me as we lingered over coffee and dessert. She understands the complexity of those relationships in a way that most people can't. I looked at my daughter, this strong, compassionate woman who'd taken her own pain and transformed it into a way to help others. The girl who'd once written letters to her father begging him to come home had become someone who helped other children understand that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we most need protection from. I never imagined, I said softly, that something good could come from all that darkness. Sadie reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture that still felt new and precious between us. You gave me the foundation for it, even if I couldn't see it at the time. All those nights you came home exhausted from protecting me, all the sacrifices you made that I was too young to understand, they taught me what real love looks like. It just took me a very long time to recognize it. After James left and Marcus had gone to bed, Sadie and I found ourselves alone in her kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the evening. It had become our routine, these quiet moments together, where some of our deepest conversations happened. I have something for you, Sadie said suddenly, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a small wrapped package. I've been waiting for the right moment to give it to you. Inside the tissue paper was a framed photograph I'd never seen before. It showed the two of us when Sadie was about 10 years old, sitting on the front porch of our old house. She was leaning against me, my arms wrapped around her, both of us laughing at something outside the camera's range. I looked tired in the photo, older than my years, but genuinely happy. I found it in a box of old things when I was packing to move in with Marcus, Sadie explained. I remember that day. You'd gotten off work early because it was my birthday, and we'd spent the whole afternoon together, just the two of us. You taught me how to braid friendship bracelets, and we ate ice cream for lunch. I traced the glass with one finger, remembering. It had been one of the rare days when David was out of town for work, when I could relax my constant vigilance and just be a mother playing with her child. I used to look at this picture and feel angry, Sadie continued. Because I remembered how rare those days were, how most of the time you seemed distracted or worried or just not fully there. But now I understand that you weren't absent by choice. You were fighting a war I couldn't see, and those moments when you could be fully present were stolen from a man who wanted to take everything from you. I set the photo down carefully, my throat tight with emotion. I want you to know, she said, that I'm not expecting you to forget the years I was cruel to you. I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't happen or that it didn't hurt. But I'm hoping we can build something new together, something based on who we really are instead of who David tried to make us believe we were. I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd inherited my stubborn streak and my capacity for love, who'd survived her own form of abuse at the hands of a father who'd used her as a weapon against me without her ever knowing it. I never stopped loving you, I told her. Even when you hated me, even when you excluded me from the most important moments of your life, I never stopped being proud of the woman you became. And I never stopped hoping that someday you'd find your way back to me. She hugged me then, really hugged me, for the first time in over 20 years. I felt her tears against my shoulder and tasted my own on my lips, and I thought about all the ways we'd both been broken by one man's cruelty and all the ways we'd found to heal. I love you, Mom, she whispered into my hair. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember how. As I drove home that night, the framed photograph on my passenger seat catching the streetlight, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. It hadn't been the fairy tale reconciliation I'd once dreamed of, where my daughter would realize her mistake and everything would go back to the way it was before. Instead, it had been something more valuable, the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust. The courage to tell painful truths and the grace to receive them. The recognition that love sometimes means letting people hate you for the wrong reasons until they're strong enough to handle the right ones. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment in the darkness, holding that photograph and thinking about the 10-year-old girl who'd trusted me enough to lean against me, to let me hold her close. She was still there, somewhere inside the woman who'd needed 25 years to find her way back to understanding. Sometimes the longest journeys are the ones that bring us home to ourselves. And sometimes coming home means learning to forgive. Not just the people who hurt us, but the people we became in response to that hurt. Tonight, for the first time in decades, I felt truly at peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was finally, honestly, real.